Hello and welcome to 10 Lenses. This is our 5th session, and today we're talking about parallels in the Bible. Now, in the first session of 10 Lenses about translations, we used the word parallel to talk about putting various translations of the Bible next to each other, in parallel lines. That's one use of the word parallel when we're talking about biblical interpretation, but there's another. And that is when we look at stories from various parts of the Bible and put them next to each other to see the various differences and similarities. This is most helpful when we're talking about studying the gospel. Now, there's only one gospel, and that's the gospel of Jesus Christ. But in the Bible, we have 4 accounts of the gospel: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 3 accounts of the gospel, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, follow roughly the same story arc. They're not exactly the same, but they follow basically the same pattern over the course of their accounts. There's some contractions and some additions in various places, but they follow roughly the same story. John, on the other hand, takes a lot of the same material, but puts it in a different order, tells the story in a different way, and sometimes it's not grouped with the other 3. Those first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are often known as the synoptic gospels. Synoptic meaning with the same eyes. But John is sort of put into its own category. However, there are places where all 4 accounts of the gospel line up really nicely. This is seen most clearly in the passion narratives of each gospel, that is, Jesus' trial and his crucifixion. But there are a few other places where they also line up, and this week we're going to talk about one of them as we study parallels, and that is the feeding of the 5,000. Before we look at the parallels of the feeding of the 5,000, I want to tackle a question that you might be having. The question is, if the gospel is true, then why do we have 4 accounts that say different things? It's a really good question. The best answer that I can give you is by looking at a different facet of life. Think of it this way. Someone commits a crime to which there are half a dozen eyewitnesses. When it comes time for those eyewitnesses to give their testimony in court, each one is going to say something a little bit different, even though they all witnessed the same crime. This is because even though the crime took place with them all watching, they all saw the crime from their own perspective, which means their interpretation of the crime is going to be a little bit different. If all 6 people said the exact same thing, it's pretty clear that they got together and fixed their story. And this means that they're not telling the truth. Okay, so now let's look at the gospel that way. If all 4 accounts said the exact same thing, then we wouldn't need 4 accounts, we would only need 1. But because they all say the same story basically from different perspectives, we get the opportunity to put those different perspectives in conversation with one another and maybe come to even deeper truths than we would get if we were only reading 1. And I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so just that we're clear, parallels in the gospel are when a story in one account looks really similar to a story in another account. Not all 4 accounts have to have that story for us to put them in conversation with each other, but the more accounts that have the story means the more perspectives we get to look at. The feeding of the 5,000 is actually probably the best example of parallels in the entire gospel, because the stories are so similar, but they still vary in some interesting details. So when we look at parallels, we get to look at what is the same in the stories, and we get to look at what is different. We can also compare where the different writers put the story in their gospels. So now we get to the fun part. I'm going to have you read all 4 accounts of the feeding of the 5,000, and a little bit longer, in some of them, Jesus walking on water. I want you to pause this video and read them. You can do that by either going into your Bible and finding them all, or clicking the link right below this video, and it will download a PDF file where you can read them, where I put them in parallel with each other. So right now, go ahead and pause it, read the 4 accounts, and we'll come right back to it. I'm going to give you 3 images that you can pause on. Here you go. We're back. We're talking about parallels in the gospel. We're talking about the feeding of the 5,000 in the 4 accounts of the gospel. All right, so we get to talk about how those accounts are similar how they're different. And in putting them in conversation with each other, we can maybe come to some deeper understanding of the story as a whole. My favorite similarity among the 4 accounts of the feeding of the 5,000 is that Jesus gives thanks before distributing the loaves and the fishes. I think this is an integral piece of the story. Another great similarity is that in all 4 accounts, each disciple gets to collect a basket of scraps. There are also some interesting differences. For some reason, John is the only one that tells us what kind of bread they're eating. Barley loaves. I don't really know what that says about the story, but it's really interesting that John is really specific about the kind of bread. It's possible that John talks about the kind of bread where the others don't, because in John, the feeding of the 5,000 launches into a really long speech that Jesus makes about being the bread of life. And so maybe describing the bread that they eat the day before in the feeding of the 5,000 helps us to imagine the scene better. Other parallel stories in the gospel include Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers and animal sellers in the temple, Jesus having a meal in the upper room with his disciples, Jesus triumphantly entering Jerusalem on the back of the donkey, and then most importantly, the passion narrative like I mentioned earlier, Jesus' trial and his crucifixion. That is a wonderful passage of the gospel to put in conversation because it really makes us go deeper and deeper into the story. So the next time you study the gospel, go ahead and look at the story you're reading and see if the other accounts of the gospel also contain the story. Read the story in those accounts as well. And we'll see you again next time on 10 Lenses.